Welcome back to Sika Strength. Welcome back to the weekly Q&A. Please leave your questions down below. And without further ado, let's get straight into the first question. How do you know if you're progressing at a good pace? This man is doubting his coach.
So this is actually the most common type of question we got this week. I think we had around 6 or 7 different forms of this question. Now, this really comes out...
Not specifically on the coach, like in terms of just, am I progressing fast?
Yes. Yeah.
Don't hate your coaches, guys.
So this really comes down to where you're at in your career, comes down to where you're at with the sport or with the movements themselves. Obviously, there are massive peaks and troughs, and the slope of that line as to how quickly you progress really is quite variable. So people commonly throw out a thing that you should be able to gain 20 kilos on your squat every year. You should be able to gain 10 kilos on your squat every year. That's certainly true in many cases. But for your snatch, for your clean and jerk, for your back squat, for your front squat, these levels of progress will ebb and flow. Now, what I will say is you should certainly be seeing progress in some area of the lift or in some area of your training. Now, that might look like a new 1RM. That might look like the technique becoming much better. That might look like you being more consistent at 90% or above of 1 rep max. That might also look like you having the similar level of output and the similar level of outcomes from your training with a lower load in training or with a better kind of life and training balance. So if you're somebody and you've gone from university style training and you've been able to train 6 times a week as hard as you possibly want with nothing else basically going on in your life, and now you've gone to full-time employment, maybe you have other things you need to keep up with in terms of giving time to relationships or friends or family or any of that, then in those cases, being able to get the same levels of outcome with far less input is a massive amount of progress. The final point I'd like to say here is if your technique isn't getting better and there's not clear reasons for why it's going down in its quality, so maybe you're losing a massive amount of weight very quickly, obviously technique is going to change and alter there, and it will take a while for you to adjust to that new body size and body shape, then in those cases, a slight decrement in technique can be somewhat acceptable, but across the board, your technique should be improving all the time in every training cycle, no matter what's going on.
I can do 5x5 reps with 50 kilos on the bench press, but the user said he can't bench more than 100 kilos for a set of 4. So this comes down to strength specificity and exercise specificity. So strength is obviously general. That's why S&C works, of course, for sports. And it's why someone who can deadlift or squat 300 kilos, and if they've never deadlifted, will probably still be able to have a pretty large deadlift, 220 or maybe more, depending on what they're used to. So the issue here is that it could be a technical issue also. So your bench press technique might be poor, your dip technique could be poor, your dip form could be poor, you could be cutting the range of motion. There's ways you can do, say, heavy dips that are not cheating per se, because you're not cheating anyone unless you're doing street lifting, but they are a style of dip where not really getting a huge range of motion through that joint, where you're essentially hinging at the hips. You're sending your hips backwards and you are getting some pressing motion through that upper body, but you're not really being super honest with it. So that could also be a possibility. But I'd probably still err back to that first one and say that while that is a very impressive number, if you're doing full range of motion, good technique dips with 50 kilos, very, very impressive for sure, it's still ultimately only 50 kilos on top of your body weight. So while it is a good lift, it's certainly a great assistance exercise for your bench press. It's a very good upper body exercise. It's still not 100 kilos in the bench press. If we're looking at 100 for 4, we might be looking at 120 kilos for 1. So we're not really going to be getting a one-to-one transfer there. So weighted dips for your upper body for bench press are great, but ultimately it's not bench pressing. So if you'd said this, you'd never bench press before, you'd only ever done weighted dips, and the first time you'd done bench press and it was 100 for 4 reps, that would be massively impressive. So try and put it in context in that regard. But again, you need to get better at benching here and not be so worried about your dipping progress.
I started weightlifting like 3 years ago. I've been following a couple of Ollie lifting programs over the past 2 years, but haven't made much progress with my numbers. I've got technical feedback from experienced people and don't consider my technique perfect, but it's decent. So I believe I'm stuck because of lack of strength. Best back squat 120 kilos, can barely strict press 45 kilos, very low for an 85 kilo 24-year-old man. Which would be the best workaround to fix this strength problem, to keep pushing Ollie lifts and try and build a good general strength foundation? So let's firstly talk about it. If you're an 85 kilo adult male, you're probably wanting to get up above 85 to around 100 kilos in the snatch is probably what you're aiming for right now. Now, you can snatch 100 kilos with a 150, 160 back squat. Certainly very doable. That is enough strength. Now, where you're at the moment with 120, you certainly need to be adding that 30 or 40 kilos onto the back squat pretty soon. In the next kind of year or so would be ideal. Now, what makes the snatch even easier is if your back squat is 170 or 180. So pushing those strength numbers up so you don't have that massive deficit allows you firstly just to manhandle the weights a bit more, maintain your positions better during that actual pull or that extension. But over the course of an entire training block, all of those technically challenging sessions and technically challenging movements become slightly more easy. So imagine if you're pulling off the floor at the moment, let's say you're pulling 80 kilos in the snatch. If that 80 kilos is within 90% of your maximum ability to pull a barbell off the floor, it's very difficult to be consistent, and it's also very difficult to make technical changes. So firstly, back squat needs to be massively increased. What would I personally do? Well, for any of our athletes, we never like them to go off and just do a strength training phase. What we like to do is continue Olympic weightlifting. So keep going with your snatch and your clean and jerk, keep making progress there, keep focusing on those technical aspects, but you really put a bias towards the strength. So you're still only going to squat twice per week with the back squat, maybe front squat once per week, but in those sessions you have to be giving it much more intensity, allowing that squat to take over more of that recovery capital, and really looking to add kind of 20 kilos in the next 6 months to 12 months.
Clark is asking, he understands that the Palov press is for anti-rotational forces, but is there really that much need for it in the back squat or in daily life? Basically, he said he just hates Palov presses. So the issue or the problem here is we don't need to necessarily think about core work as being super specific to those movements. Core work is largely about coordination from your lower body to your upper body, and then the particular conduit in between. Core work is very often coordination work or skill-based work. So core work is somewhat strength training. Of course, it is. Coordination as part of strength training and building a connection with specific muscle groups. It's one of the benefits of large multi-joint compound lifts. And looking at your coordination of your core, when we look at including maybe everything below your nipple and everything above your pubic line, or whatever you want to say, is the area we're looking at there. Building coordination with that is really important to increase your coordination with those bigger compound lifts. And so the Palov press is one really useful one of those for maintaining static. So when we're looking at that in relation to the back squat, we're looking at the back squat and we're trying to keep our torso angle. We're trying to keep our torso, upper back and lower back muscular contractions very, very similar throughout the most of the lift. We don't really want those changing as much as we can help with in regards to the nature of that lift. So when we're doing Palov presses, this gives us a good opportunity to train this coordination, train the static position of these. So when we're doing any kind of core exercise, try and always think about them as a skill-based exercise first. Certainly somewhat of a strength training exercise. You know, if you're going to do really heavy weighted sit-ups, that's obviously a very useful strength training exercise for your core, but a lot of ones are very useful to build this coordination because you probably have the muscle mass there already. Most core work isn't going to build a huge amount of muscle mass in the abdominal region or the lower back region. Of course, it's going to add some, but when you look at anti-rotational or static exercises, certainly when it comes to the core, try and think of these as coordination exercises, skill-based exercises that are teaching you a skill of bracing and maintaining a brace throughout a full lift, as opposed to just specifically, this is going to build the most muscle and strength in my midline, which isn't always the case.
Up next, we have a question. Do you guys think that when doing these periods of not pushing the squat, but concentrating on hypertrophy, a volume day, stroke intensity day approach could work? Or how do you guys go about programming those periods? So in these hypertrophy or work capacity pieces, we never go to volume days, intensity days. We never do that daily undulating periodization. It's really not how we prescribe our load. Now, if we look at every hypertrophy study that's come out in any recent years, particularly some of the larger meta studies, they look at the overall effect of hypertrophy and what gets the best results, and volume is the key here. No matter what you want to listen to in terms of the big bodybuilding channels, if you're an athlete looking for hypertrophy work, you want lower intensities and higher volumes. There was that study done on the Korean professional weightlifters, lower intensities, higher volume, better outcomes in terms of hypertrophy. When we're an athlete, we're really looking to firstly limit the overall central nervous system fatigue. So if you're doing a sport, or if you're doing weightlifting, or if you're doing powerlifting, you're getting a massive amount of central nervous system fatigue anyway. In those opposing periods, when you're really pushing the squat, the deadlift, the press, whatever it is, your central nervous system is going to be incredibly taxed. So now during a hypertrophy phase, we want to get the biggest bang for our buck possible with the lowest loads possible. So in this case, it's volume the entire way through those hypertrophy pieces. This is 8s, 10s, 12s, up into the 15s in terms of reps. We really don't want the rest periods to be massively long. We want to be quite efficient with our training sessions. And then the second aspect of this is that during these periods, the hypertrophy or the gaining phases of an athlete's training, the programming and training style is only one aspect we have to concentrate on. The more important aspect by far is your general environmental conditions. Are you recovering? Are you taking on enough calories? Are those calories sufficiently surplus to your daily running or your daily training needs? And on top of that, will that allow you to gain muscle? So it's not just about the programming, but when it is about the programming, we never do daily undulating programming. We really want to have a specific voluminous block of training that we'll get the best results possible from.
Jacob is wondering, do we ever think about exercise sequencing in the Olympic lifts? Are we going from a hang snatch to a low hang snatch to a snatch from the floor? And yes, we do, but not in this format. So we wouldn't ever take you away fully most of the time from the full snatch. So what we would do is move from more complex sets to more specific sets. So in this case, we wouldn't say you would start with only low hang snatches and then move to the full snatch. And if we did have something like that, the rest of the week would very likely include full snatches. So what we'd normally do, we would start with something like a snatch pull plus a snatch plus a hang snatch or something like that. And then as the block progresses, we would remove the hang snatch, we would remove the snatch pull, until then you'd be left with the snatch. And this would follow the same for the clean and jerk as well, with different variations. It works very, very well. It allows for some psychological reprieve from the full lifts, of course. It allows for a lot of extra volume, allows for a little bit of extra time under tension, allows for a little bit of eccentric training, which is something we don't necessarily always get in weightlifting, which can be very valuable. Also allows us to focus on the feeling of the full lift, but also on specific variations that might help our technique. Now, in the case of the hang snatch versus the low hang to the floor, this is something you might do for teaching a fully brand new beginner to weightlifting. So we'd start with the overhead squats. So we typically prescribe to new lifters the top-down method. It doesn't particularly matter which one you do, it's when you're most comfortable coaching. We find that the top-down method is the most useful. So we start with the overhead squat, then we start with the high hang snatch or a muscle snatch, and then we move eventually to the floor. Sometimes that can be done in the same session, sometimes it takes a month, depending on that style of lifter. But the idea for this can be quite useful, but we wouldn't ever really go to a program where we're doing no full snatches from the floor in the weeks leading up, and then as we get to the peak we start to introduce them. We would always have the full lifts plus some variation, then variation and complexity gets removed as you move towards the peak.
As a beginner weightlifter who's slowly nerding out on sport, what nation style of weightlifting or programming do you guys think is the best and the worst? Why? I'm not going to name the worst, but it might become apparent. Firstly, when you look at a nation system, we really want to look to nations who have a large amount of professional athletes and who are doing studies on those athletes and really looking to homogenize their training system. Think about Korea, think about Germany with these two, right? So in these cases, we have large amount of full-time or professional weightlifters or weightlifters who are being paid by their national body. And then they have a system that they apply across all weightlifters from grassroots up. Now, what this allows the coaches to do and the development staff to do is have a really good system and framework that's constantly being tweaked in terms of this is how we get a 12 or 14-year-old to start snatching. This is how we start a beginner to do a clean and jerk. This is how we'll progress their strength. This is how we'll want them to focus on technique. Now, when we have those systems in place for decades, we get very well-refined systems. We also get incredible amounts of institutional knowledge within those federations and within those teams, which make a huge difference for somebody like you or somebody like the person watching this video to be able to then look at their weightlifters, look at their training, and try and glean good, valuable information from that. Now, the opposite case to this is countries where we don't really have a holistic national system. We might just have 50 coaches coaching 50 different athletes, and in that case it's incredibly difficult to learn from. So every country has good talent. Every country has exceptional weightlifters and exceptional weightlifting coaches. But in terms of being able to learn from countries and learn from national teams, we really want a national team that's all singing off the same hymn sheet. We want weightlifters who are all being taught the same technical model, and they're the best places we can learn from. Not necessarily a case where we might have 300 million people and we have 4 or 5 really good unicorn athletes over there. What we want is we want to have a country with 40 million people with a great system that we can look at every single aspect, identify the key defining factors of their system within those frameworks, and then bring that into our own training.
Angus is asking about the technical progression and weight progression that we've described for a weightlifting program in the last few months. So we've put up a couple of lectures in regards to this, longer, certainly longer than we can give you today in this segment of the Q&A. But we talked about how we progress training. A lot of those lectures were from seminars that we had given in the recent months. They're a couple of hours long, so I'd highly recommend you go looking at them if you're looking to program weightlifting or if you want to understand more about it. Now, you're saying that how does this lend itself to periodization? Well, this does fit the template of periodization. So remember, periodization is just the theory with how we go from a less well-trained state to a more trained state or to a desired outcome. So these particular blocks follow that template. If we look at this higher volume section of the block where we start with our triples and then we move to our singles, we are periodizing our training. It's just not necessarily a very distinct block periodization where we go, okay, we're in our higher volume phase now, and then we're changing everything to our next volume phase or our realization phase. They follow that same template. So remember, again, periodization is just a theory with how we approach it, and then the programming is either the specific nuances of the coach or it's the product that you're using, and it's not necessarily the biological adaptation, which is what we'd follow here. So this does fit that. You could post hoc apply this to it. So rational post applying, your templates to things can be done quite frequently as things work out. So I wouldn't necessarily be too concerned. Just follow that format if you're trying to program for yourself and you'll be okay, because this follows that idea pretty similarly. And is there a second part to that? Okay, so should the average intermediate be worried about phasic structure? No, definitely not. Most athletes probably shouldn't be programming for themselves is what I'd probably say to that. So to zoom out further, programming for yourself is fun. If you are not super concerned about being the best athlete you can possibly be, but enjoying training the most, some people really enjoy coaching and programming for themselves. Now, you might think I'm super biased here. You might think that I'm trying to sell you a product here, that I'm trying to gatekeep programming for yourself. We've said this for years ad nauseum. I still get coaching from Anton. Now, I do my own programming, but I do fortunately have 15 odd years of experience, lots of very bad experience coaching myself. We were just watching old videos of me training and I was blaming Dara for not pointing out some obvious flaws that I had at the time. Dara said I wouldn't listen, which I don't agree with because I don't like listening to Dara. The issue, just programming for yourself, technical adaptations for yourself are so hard. Weightlifting is really fucking hard. It's so difficult to really get better at weightlifting, especially once you get beyond certain numbers. And I would applaud anyone who wants to just do it themselves. It's fun, it's your life, it's your training, you should do what you want to do. But as an advisory to you, to answer the question, just to zoom out even further, like not even answering your specific question, just programming for yourself, you're just going to waste so much time. And this is the thing we're always talking about Sika Strength, and this is kind of how I'd sum up our mission at Sika Strength. The company policy is stop you wasting your time. Whether you be a professional athlete who comes to us, whether it's a rugby player or a speed kayaker, whoever comes to us, all the way to an amateur weightlifter, We just want you to not waste your time. Now, the stakes for that professional athlete are very important. We don't want them wasting their time. But I don't want you spending 2 years being like, maybe I just suck at weightlifting. When in reality, it could just be that your programming is so bad, it couldn't possibly allow you an opportunity to progress.
How important is hypertrophy or hypertrophy to strength gains? It is massively important. Now, what I'm going to say here is hypertrophy allows you the space or allows you the capacity to get strong. Hypertrophy of muscle tissue is essentially giving you more contractile strength to be able to go forth and learn how to squat big heavy weights. But think about it like a bucket. If I have a bucket that holds 2 litres of water, I can never hold more than 2 litres of water within that bucket. Same way, if I have a muscle mass of 40 kilos, I'm never going to be able to surpass that in terms of my absolute ability to get strong. Now, what I will say is, you've got some massive bodybuilders that are incredibly weak because they gain a massive amount of muscle tissue, never really do any of that neurological training or those muscle tendon unit adaptations that they need. And so they have the capacity to become incredibly strong, but they never do become incredibly strong. Now, are most people utilizing all of their muscle tissue to the best they possibly could? Absolutely not. What you're going to see is probably in some of the sprinting or speed sports, certainly in weightlifting and certainly in throwing, you'll see athletes who have incredible levels of central and peripheral nervous system adaptation, where basically they can shoot as many of those neurotransmitters down their spinal column and out to that muscle tendon unit as quickly as they possibly can. Now, in those cases, it's very possible that they are having better rate sequencing of those muscles. They're contracting those muscle fibers faster and harder than most other people will. So certainly if you're 70 kilos right now and you are squatting 2.5 times body weight, you're probably at the point where you're just about at the limit of what that amount of muscle mass can do, and adding 5 kilos of lean tissue will almost certainly make you a lot stronger. Now, in many cases as well, people will think about their relative size and how strong they are without ever really thinking about lean tissue mass. So you might be 90 kilos, kind of skinny fat, not really that lean, and you'll think, oh, I'm 90 kilos now, I should be squatting double body weight. I can't squat 180 kilos yet, so I don't need to gain any muscle, thus I won't do any hypertrophy work. Now, hypertrophy work is very, very important to keep that tissue growing all the time, to make sure you're as much lean tissue as you are anything else. So being as lean as possible, having as much muscle as possible is absolutely vital to strength.
What's your opinion on doing the snatch and the clean casually? So I actually think this is quite fun. I think some people should do this if you have an interest. If you want to do the snatch, if you want to do the clean or the clean and the jerk, you should definitely go right ahead and do them. The important thing here is just to manage expectations. It's not that you need to go get a coach. It's not that you need to go run specific programs. While all of these would help, but if you're looking at running these just casually, the main thing I need you to understand here is that you probably won't progress unbelievably well in them, or you might not see much progress at all. But as long as you're enjoying them, as long as you're having fun doing them, that's the most important thing here. We talked recently or earlier in this same video about just how hard weightlifting is, how hard the sport of weightlifting is to get better. Even if you're talented at it, even if you're giving all your resources towards the sport, it's still very hard to get better at them. So the main thing I would say here, if you're doing them casually, understand that casual interpretation or casual implementation of your training will give you casual results, which usually in weightlifting will mean limited to no results. It may even mean regression. In the initial part of your training, you'll probably see some progression. You know, if you start with 30 kilo snatches, you could get to 60, 70, 80 kilo snatches without a huge amount of main focus on those lifts. But at a certain stage, that will peter out. And then eventually, unless you're supremely talented, unless you're just a freak of nature, and you'll probably already know that, you're probably going to see no progress. But that doesn't mean you can't enjoy them. It just means that you need to be understanding of the snatch and the clean and just approach training, because this is a problem weightlifters have when they're doing weightlifting. They are upset that they're not progressing, and fair, because you're putting 10, 12, 15, 20 hours into something a week, and you're thinking about it with your nutrition, you're thinking about it with your schedule, and you're thinking about it with your relationships, and you're thinking about it when you go to sleep and your recovery, and you still don't make progress. So it's understandable in those cases why it's not working, and maybe you're paying for a coach or you're paying for an expensive gym membership and you're not making progress. So when they don't progress, they kind of have a right to be somewhat upset. So if you're doing it casually, just the most important thing here is just to understand that it's just fun and it's not a big deal if you don't progress.
Any tips on how to work on specific mobility restrictions, morning routine, before sessions, between warm-up sets? What works best in your opinion? Any mobility recommendations or benchmarks for amateur weightlifters? So let's start off with the last one. For amateur weightlifters, I want you to be able to hit every position you need to hit for a snatch, for the clean, or for the jerk, unweighted and pretty much unwarmed up. So let's say you come into the gym, you do 15 minutes of your cardio work, you start a general warm-up, you should be able to grab a PVC pipe or a timber dowel, sit into an overhead squat where you're going to catch your snatch. You should be able to get into the start position of your snatch without any weight on the bar, without having to pull yourself into that position. Now for the clean, I really want you to be able to rack a barbell. If you're a bit bigger, a 20 kilo barbell is okay. Ideally, you want to be able to rack an empty timber dowel or PVC pipe without a massive amount of warm up and soft tissue work. You should also be able to hold that overhead position with full elbow extension without any major amount of warming up. That's a great place to get to. If you're at the position where you're not quite there yet, what's the best way of getting there? In my opinion, the best way of getting there is having mobility sessions separate from your normal training. So giving yourself 30 minutes, 45 minutes, or 60 minutes, at least 4 or 5 times per week, where you're really going to address those pieces. I like there to be a kind of triple step approach. So the first one I like is some self-massage or some myofascial release, whether that be with a foam roller, whether that's with a massage gun, a lacrosse ball, whether that's just with your own thumb or your own elbow getting into your quad or your calf, working on those muscle tissues, trying to break down any of those points of adhesion within the muscle. That's the first thing. The second thing I like then is that, assuming the muscle is warm, you've moved it around a small bit, is to just be going through those full ranges of motion under control. So let's say somebody has quite tight hips. I want them to get into a standard squatting stance and start working through some of those bodyweight squats, bodyweight overhead squats. The final thing I like then is long hold static stretches. So if that's the bottom of a squat, I want to sit into the bottom of a squat. If it's my hamstrings and posterior chain, I want to sit into that, whether that be a pancake stance or whatever it is, sit in there. We're talking about 90 seconds, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, holding those static stretches, really getting to the point where you can feel that lengthening, you can feel yourself achieving new ranges at the end of that range of motion you had previously. With that kind of 3-step approach, you should be able to fill up your 30 or 45 minutes very easily. I like people to work through those in terms of circuits. So it might be that I'm working on my calves and my ankles. I'm going to give 2 minutes on each calf with a foam roller, really going hard on the foam roller, maybe even moving on to a barbell and rolling with the barbell instead. 2 minutes each side, I'm up to 4 minutes for the start of my circuit. Then I'm going to do 2 minutes each side on the general movement through it. So let's imagine front foot raise split squat where I'm really pushing that knee over the toe. I'm going to go 10 reps each side, swapping over and back until the 2 minutes is up. Then I'm up to 8 minutes for the first circuit, and then I will just hold the static stretch. So leg hanging or heel hanging out over a step, putting all of my body weight down in it. Maybe I'm sitting in a kind of split squat stance with a plate on top of my knee, pushing my knee forward over my toes. You'll see now how very quickly one round of that circuit adds up to 12 minutes. Even if I just do 3 rounds of that circuit, I'm well past half an hour, and now I've worked through that ankle mobility. The reason I like people to do that far away from a training session, so let's say you do that in the morning before you go to work and then you train in the evening, I like that bit of distance because there can be some amount of neurological inhibition which comes with those long hold static stretches. There can also be some pain and discomfort that comes, whether that's in the tendon unit or the muscle itself, coming from the myofascial release work, coming from those longer hold stretches, and people sometimes feel like they are neurologically inhibited from that pain or just from those static stretches. Now, a lot of you will remember about 5 or 10 years ago, there used to be a big push against static stretches. We need to make everything dynamic. And that is certainly true, where if we do a massive amount of long hold static stretches as we're warming up or directly preceding a maximal power output piece, imagine a snatch. You hold your hamstrings in as tight a stretch as you possibly can for 2 minutes and then try to snatch. Then there is certainly an inhibition curve which comes along after that. Now, if we do it maybe half an hour before, we're not really going to see any effect. Certainly, if we do it a couple of hours before, we're going to see zero effect on any of our power outputs. So I really like them to be that bit further away from training sessions. The final thing I will say is that if you're looking for increases in range of motion, irrelevant of where that increase in range of motion is coming from, you need to be doing more of that stretching, more of that myofascial release work, and you need to be doing it for far longer than you think you should be.
The Sika deadlift program starts out really light for the first 3 weeks, and the user is saying that basically it feels like there's almost no meaningful work being done in these weeks, or it feels like there doesn't provide much benefit. Could you go into the reasoning for that, and why did we do this in the initial weeks? So there's a couple of reasons we would do this in regards to programming. One of the first ones is that higher volume training is incredibly beneficial. We recently made a full length video around this where Fitz talks about the multiple benefits for high volume training and how important not only do we believe it to be, but how important we see it to be with quite literally thousands of athletes at this stage. And if you look at research and how you interpret it, that's all important as well. But higher volume work is really, really important. The deadlift is no different. Higher volume deadlifting, while a little bit more uncomfortable, somewhat enjoyable for some people, is very, very important to produce meaningful results. One of the notable things about a deadlift is that heavy deadlifts are very fatiguing. Now, there's actually a different way you could approach strength training. It's not a way that we're huge fans of. Sometimes we'll do it with an athlete we're super au fait with, we're super outstanding with. We might even use it ourselves at certain points of training where you actually repeat sessions of a training and you keep doing those same sessions, or you add a little bit after a couple of practice sessions where you allow this adaptation to occur. So what you could do here is, if you imagine that phasic structure of periodization and the deadlift, at the bottom here we're doing our multiple sets of 10, or we're doing our AMRAPs. We come in somewhere along the middle. We do similar sets and reps that we would see in the middle. We might do, let's say, 5x5 or 6x6. And here we repeat that session. So if we had something like a 200 kilo deadlift, we might come in here at 150 kilos and we might hit these same sessions a few times. We might do 150 kilos 6x6 2-3 times maybe. And we're getting an adaptation here. You know, repeating a session doesn't mean that you're stalling out. If you're repeating a session, it doesn't mean that you're stagnating at all. It simply means that you're getting a different kind of adaptation. You're approaching strength training a different way. Then in these cases, you might move up, you might add more sets, you might add more reps and keep the sets the same and keep the weight the same. So there's different ways of doing this. These we have found are somewhat messy. These allow for a lot of room for error. These can really put you in a bad place where you fuck up a whole training block, where you come in just a bit too heavy, and instead of coming in the right place where you do your 5x5 and next week you do your 5x5 again at the same weight, sometimes you can come in and you end up doing 4x5 and then one set of 4, and on deadlifts you're like, oh shit, this isn't a good start. Then next week you're like, okay, I'm going to do the 5x5, and you might do that 5x5 the next week, but it's really difficult. And then the week after, repeating that 5x5 just isn't possible because the fatigue that you've incurred from those 2 previous sessions is so high that you haven't been able to recover for the next session. So then you have to go back, or you have to go, okay, I've kind of put myself in here. I need to either nut up or shut up. So I'm going to go to the next session. So I'm going to go to my trees. You're already fatigued. Then you hit your trees. And then you've put yourself in this place where you've really overshot your ability to recover. You've overshot the weights. And then you're left with essentially a wasted training block. And this is something that happens to people so often. And it's one of the biggest things we see when people run our programs is they come in and they do the high volume work. And they were like, that was brutal. I haven't done that in ages. And then lo and behold, they hit massive PBs by the end. One of the big benefits from us is that you get that high volume work for technical practice, exposing of fatigue and errors. We get some muscular adaptation. That higher volume training gives a little bit of extra muscle mass, which is very important for strength training, of course. But also from our point of view, when we're programming for a large group of athletes, even with the features in our very good app on Sikastrength app on iOS and Android, you still need to come in very, very light. There's no reason to come in, or there's no reason not to come in very light within reason. You know, we're not going to start at 10% of your max, 20%. There's certain percentages where we can come in and we can say, okay, 1 or 2 weeks might be a little bit of extra light, but we're guaranteeing ourselves that we're getting this really nice runway into that training block to ensure that we don't hit that wall like we would otherwise. So for some people, that first week or 2 weeks might be a little bit too light, but that's not the case for most people. Very often people are terrible at judging this. So often people will be like, no, I'm that person where this is too light. And then we increase the weight or the reps, and then next thing you know, you absolutely hit a brick wall a couple of weeks later and the program doesn't go as planned. Whereas if you let yourself just practice those lighter weights, very often you'll get a benefit. Lastly, I would say it's really important to remember that not every training session should feel like you're absolutely demolishing yourself. And there's no reason that 3 weeks of a 10-week program or 12-week program can't feel pretty easy. They should feel pretty casual. You know, if you're into a sessions where every session feels like you're going to war with yourself, you've definitely gone too heavy and it's going to end in disaster.
What's the best way to program for connective tissue strength to be consistent with or even stronger than muscle strength, assuming full range of motion is already being performed? Suggested number of mesocycles per rep range. Okay, few things to get into here first. Connective tissue and muscle tissue are inherently linked. So the muscle tendon unit is inherently linked together. We don't necessarily have this thing, and I know we're all somewhat aware of this thing of muscles growing incredibly quickly due to the use of AAS or something along those lines, muscles being massive and incredibly strong, and then this tiny dwindly tendon on the end of it. Now, that is true for IFBB pros, that is true for enhanced bodybuilders. If you're in the athletic population and training, it is incredibly rare. Now, what do we need for a tendon to become strong? Well, we need the tendon to actually be used. So in much bodybuilding training, we never really see stimulation of the tendon. Why is that? Well, the tendon is essentially an elastic unit on the end of a large contractile mass. And that elastic unit, as long as that mass is moving and contracting quite slowly, that elastic unit is never really being taxed all that much. So imagine I have a block on the end, or tied onto that block of an elastic band. As long as I move that block up and down through space quite slowly, the elastic band is never really being stretched, it's never really being taxed. If I now decide that I'm going to move my hand down very quickly and the block will drop, then I stop my hand, that elastic band will stretch. Now I'm stimulating that tendon to become thicker, to become stronger, to become an overall more integral unit to the muscle tendon, right? So I'm making that a stronger unit overall because I'm taxing it. Now, how do I go about training that? Well, the first thing is, if I'm doing quite quick squats, if I'm catching heavy power cleans, if I'm jumping and landing, if I'm sprinting and stopping, if I'm doing a lot of agility work, those tendons are working overtime anyway. Mostly we'll see the tendon being overused rather than underdeveloped. If I'm not in that case, and I have been the bodybuilder and I have been doing really slow squats or a load of pause squats, well then in that case I do need to maybe give a little bit of supplemental stimulus to those tendons, because now maybe I want to try weightlifting. So in that case, what I'd recommend doing is starting off with isometrics. So very, very simple isometrics. If it's my patellar tendon, I would literally go to a quad extension machine, lift up against that resistance with 2 legs, and then hold it there with 1 leg. Just go to 20 or 30 seconds each side. Don't go until you start shaking. You don't really want that shaking response to start coming in. You certainly shouldn't be inducing pain in the tendon or pain in the joint. And then 5 sets of 30 seconds each side is going to be perfectly sufficient as a starting point. Now, what I would look to do is increase the length of time we're holding those isometric holds for. And once we get up around 1.5 minutes or 2 minutes of an isometric hold at whatever joint it is, we can slowly increase the load there. Moving on from there then, once I've done a sufficient amount of isometric training where I feel rock solid no matter what it is, no matter what the load is, no matter how long I'm trying to hold it for, Then we can start looking at some base level plyometrics to get even more of that tendon stimulus that you so desperately want. So in this case, to go into something like a simple jump off a box, land on the floor, be quite rigid when you're landing, don't allow yourself to flop down into a squat. These kind of things, fundamental plyometrics, are absolutely perfect for that. You certainly don't need to start going to massive drop jumps. You certainly don't need to be going through big rebounding hurdles. If you're at the point where maybe you're a parkour athlete, maybe you're a sprinter, maybe you're a high jumper and you need to start really getting that additional tendon stimulus, this isn't for you. These baseline tendon stimulus pieces aren't what I'm recommending here. You'll need something more advanced, and that's not really the point of this answer.
What's the difference between the RTA 1 and the RTA 2? So the idea behind this basically is that the RTA 1 is more aggressive. It's something that happens over a shorter time frame, and it's something that people basically wanted was a dedicated 2-month period to push their squat as hard as they possibly could. 8 weeks was essentially the shortest time frame we felt that you could make meaningful progress on your squat without having to do a ridiculous amount of frequency and volume and intensity in those sessions. It is quite intense. We make no bones about that. We tell people it's difficult. People understand that. In some weird way, many of you like how hard it is because for whatever sadistic reason you have for yourself, a lot of people like the urgency and the intensity of those 8 weeks. It's a nice time period where you're going, okay, I have 8 weeks with 16 sessions. I'm going to destroy these, improve my squat, and get on with the rest of my year. So this was for athletes or weightlifters. So that 8 weeks was a nice time frame where it was the minimum we thought that you could get an effective training block in. 6 and less is just a bit too short. Not impossible by any means, but the 8 weeks is a pretty sweet spot there. RTA 2 is 12 weeks long. That's an extra 4 weeks. That's a lot in training in terms of these shorter, intense training blocks. So there's a lot more initial volume, but the ride in is a little bit easier in the initial weeks. There's more volume. There's some AMRAPs in RTA 2.0, but the program isn't easier. It's just not quite as intense in a short period of time. We find some people really like the RTA 2.0 for that reason. They're doing it because they enjoy the surgical, consistent nature. They enjoy stacking up those good sessions. They enjoy hitting those AMRAPs. Whereas other people, a little bit more mental, just really enjoy that 8-week session. So what I'd recommend, if you're a weightlifter, to be honest, the 8 weeks is a little bit better. The 12-week and the higher volume might not necessarily fit in with your year. It can definitely work in terms of the volume in the RTA 2.0, but that higher volume can be a little bit interfering with your snatch and clean and jerk depending on what you're doing. Whereas we know with those 2 weeks or those 2 blocks, those 2 months, those 8-week sessions, or that 8-week RTA 1.0, you can be not taking a huge amount out of your year from weightlifting. In general, for people who aren't weightlifting, what we'd actually kind of recommend you do now is run the RTA 2.0 first, then take a little bit of a break, bit of a deload, then run the RTA 1.0, so you get a nice swing of training. Lots of people just like rerunning both programs, and then that would be obviously up to yourself and how you would do that.
Do you believe at all in using a weak point variation in the lead up to heavier lift during warm-ups? Example, working up to 90% in the snatch for reps, but using a pause in my warm-ups, doing pause plus full snatch to 70 or 80%, as well as maybe dedicating a session to it on another day. This works. So let's just take, for example, on the clean, somebody is bending their arms during the clean pull. We get them to do a clean pull plus clean plus jerk, right? That works. Absolutely. Now, the problem with using it during your warm-ups to heavier sets is it becomes a crutch, and then we start pre-fatiguing ourselves by doing multiple sets of a somewhat derivative complex as we're warming up. Is this a problem during a training block early on? No, it certainly isn't. Is this a problem when we go to compete or go for an absolute max at the end? Yes, it definitely is. What's the alternative to this? So the alternative to this is using very, very light weights for the corrective exercise or derivative exercise, putting it in immediately as we start our specific warm-up. So let's take, we arrive for our session, it's Fridays on fire, big Fridays in Sika Weightlifting Club. We do 10 minutes on the cardio machine, 10 minutes on the bike, whatever it is. I then go to my general warm-up, I'm doing some RDLs, some bent over rows, some back squats, and some strict press with a barbell. Then as I move on from that, I might do my specific mobility piece I need to do. And as I start my specific warm-up, so today I'm going to warm up to 97% for 3 snatch singles. I know that I'm making a specific mistake during my snatch. In this case, I'm going to say the imaginary mistake is I pull too quickly off the floor. I then get a slowing down as the barbell's coming into my hip because I'm ripping the bar off the floor, losing position slightly. And then I have to kind of slow the bar down as it comes into my hip. So in this case, the corrective exercise is going to be snatch with a pause at the knee and then a full snatch afterwards. I'm going to do 4 sets of that at 40 kilos, assuming I'm working up to 105 kilos today. I will do those sets at a very, very light weight as a piece, firstly, of just physiological priming, so understanding how the barbell will feel, understanding how the barbell will move. Also some neurological priming, so just reminding myself with that almost kinesthetic cue of how this is going to feel as I'm pulling on it, and then I start my actual warm-up. Now, the massive advantage of doing this is that firstly, the weights are so light and inconsequential that it really doesn't matter. This may as well be your general warm-up. It's not going to pre-fatigue you. The second thing here is that due to the fact that it's not happening in my actual warm-up cascade, so it's not happening if I usually do 50, 60, 70, 75, 80, 85, 90, whatever that standard run-in and cascade of a warm-up is as I build up to that maximal attempt, because it's not happening there, it's not as crutch-like when I then take it out. It's basically just like a piece of extra mobility or an extra piece of priming that I do before I actually start building up for the snatch, and thus it's far easier to take it out afterwards. In terms of then using those derivatives or using those complexes on another day of the week, that is absolutely perfect. I just really don't like it to be in there up around 70 to 80% of 1 rep max as we're warming up for all the reasons I mentioned.
How do you run the RTA and conditioning programs on the app together? So the most important thing you probably need to consider here is just your level of conditioning currently. So if you are looking at running the RTA squat program, obviously we would just have talked about, if you listen to one of the prior questions, is that they're pretty intense, whichever one you're running, which is fine. But if you come into this where you have a very low level of conditioning, you've never really done a lot of conditioning, or if you did, it was so far long ago that it makes no difference. You just need to be super conscious of which one you're doing. You know, if you're going to run the RTA and you suddenly decide, this is the week I'm going to start track running, that is not a good idea. Whereas if you're a super experienced track runner, if you're running someone who could run, I don't know, 5-minute miles at a casual pace, 6-7 minute miles, where you're just super au fait at running, you're used to track running, you run those programs, and then you decide to run the RTA, you're probably not going to notice a huge amount of impact from your conditioning onto your squatting. So the really thing to take note of here is just how well conditioned you are prior. And if you're really out of condition, or you've never been in very good condition, now isn't the best time to start running a conditioning program alongside the RTA. It's not to say it's not the best time to start conditioning programs, it's just you need to taper that back. Don't start coming into the RTA and thinking, I'm going to improve my conditioning hugely and I'm going to get really lean and I'm going to look like Blaine McConnell for some reason and run the squat program. It probably won't happen, unfortunately. We're not all freaks like Blaine. What you probably need to do is ease into the conditioning programs. You can taper them back. You can contact us if you have specific questions. But I would just say, if you're super well conditioned, you're probably going to be fine. Plow ahead, whatever your favorite conditioning style is. But if you're not really well conditioned, take a step back a minute and assess the load, because you'd be surprised how fatiguing those conditioning can be in the short to medium term if you're not acclimatized.
I'm on week 9 of 12 of Sika weightlifting program, and I'm wondering how soon you would recommend I run it again upon completion. Or do you typically recommend an alternative program for a while after finishing a weightlifting block? What you'll notice is the weightlifting blocks are block 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you're looking on the website, up to 13 or 14, I think, at this point. And these programs are written to be run in series. So it's not necessarily that block 1 is repeated until you pass some goal or an imaginary point where you then go on to block 2. The programs are written to be stacked on top of each other. So block 1 sets you up very, very nicely. It doesn't massively push the volume, doesn't massively push the intensity, but it gives you the perfect foundation to start into some heavier and more difficult training in block 2. And then block 3 really tapers you and gets you in great positions again. So you'll see across each of those programs, they work very well on their own. They work perfectly to bring you to a good taper to finish 2 weeks out from a competition. They also are working with each other and are somewhat collaborative. So if I finish block 1, I like people to take 3 or 4 days of full rest. So if I finish block 1 on a Saturday, I'm going to take Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday off, and I might start training again kind of Thursday or Friday of the next week. I certainly don't recommend people taking as long as 2 full weeks off of training before starting the next one, because you're just going to have a bit too much of a dip down in terms of your physical condition. And so if it is longer than 2 weeks, you would be better off doing a small bit of prep work or on-ramping before starting block 2. The final thing I would say then is, generally speaking, when we look at weightlifting blocks and how many blocks we're going to run before taking a break, we can run about 6 months of good, honest-to-God weightlifting programming before you should take some sort of break, whether that be for hypertrophy, whether that be for work capacity, whether that be for a specific strength phase, like Owen spoke about earlier, taking a couple of months off to get your squats up. In any of these cases, about 6 months is a great amount of time. You certainly don't want to get to the position where you run a month of training, then deload for a week, then a month of training, then deload for a week. You don't have enough time to ever really get rolling there with any of your training. You want longer, more consistent training blocks rather than these short, hyper-intensive, hyper-aggressive training blocks.
What's our opinion on the conjugate method for increasing squat strength? So the rotating exercises, max effort days and dynamic days within a work week. You're kind of intrigued from a longevity and a midweek recovery. So if you're interested in something from a longevity style or recovery style, maxing random exercises is definitely not the way to go, especially if you're unfamiliar with them. We have a lot of problems with the conjugate style. One of the issues, and this is something I would give them in favour of them, is that we don't really know exactly what Louis was doing with people when they say conjugate. So when someone else brings conjugate into it, or they make a video and they might have been someone who was coached by Louis, they might have trained there, what their interpretation of the conjugate style might be vastly different. Now, we know his books and literature, but I would give Louis the benefit of the doubt and see just what does a literal program look like from the conjugate style. In terms of the theory, or the one that probably most people understand, or at least from what I understand of conjugate, is that I just don't think it's a very good idea. We don't particularly love that style of training. There's a lot of reasons. It eliminates the kind of specificity principle, or SAID, or whatever, specific adaptation and imposed demands. You need to be practicing that exercise. Now, we often talk about assistance exercises. I made a video recently talking about one of my powerlifters squatting 330 kilos at 90 kilos. And we use the high bar squat as a way of supporting that. So it's not that you can't use variations, but they need to be progressive, they need to be consistent, you need to allow familiarity with them, you need to have reliable data on those exercises to progress them. So the idea behind conjugate would be that you'd have these lighter speed days, which when it comes to strength training, speed days don't do anything. There's no reason to do speed days. There's just a lighter day to recover, which is what seems to be happening there. Speed days for athletes might be something different, and there's certainly worth stuff talking about there. But when it comes to speed for athletes, they're just not that useful. We haven't seen it to be useful. Smart programming is more useful. Rotating max effort days with random barbells. Look, this might make sense if you're on an absolute ball of PEDs, you're in a suit, and you can just pick up a safety squat bar, and you're like, I reckon I could hit 700 pounds on a above parallel box squat today or whatever, which might be fine. But for the average lifter, let's say you pick safety squat bar, cambered squat bar to box, and your low bar squat. Like, you're going to be low bar squatting, let's say, every 3 weeks. You're going to be cambered squatting to a box every 3 weeks. You're going to be doing your safety bar squat to a box or whatever every 3 weeks. Like, you're going to have very little familiarity with them. You're going to have no consecutive days where you can increase the volume or increase the intensity or adapt to one of the variables we know that needs to be changed as the weeks go on. And so you're going to be left, certainly for the average lifter, certainly for somebody who's not on a ball of PDs, making very little progress. And the evidence in the way we would program is the way most people program. So there'll be huge evidence in favour of that. But I don't know of anyone who's actually very strong in a full range of motion compound lifts who uses conjugate who's not in equipped powerlifting. I'm very happy to know. I don't think for a second that Louis couldn't progress those. I bet if Louis was still alive and he was coaching a lot of raw powerlifters, I bet he could make them stronger. But as applying the conjugate method to the average lifter, don't waste your time. Give it a go if you want. Enjoy your training. We're all about that. Enjoying experimenting training for sure. But our main goal, as we say at Sikastrength, is you not waste your time. So I would encourage you just to not bother. But give it a go if you want to see how your body adapts, see what you might understand from what I'm saying here. But I don't. So far, our program has worked for 330 kilo squats. So I think that's a decent step so far. There's also been multiple 300 plus kilo squatters. So there's been more than one, and thousands of people in the 200s and sub 200s. So it's doing all right.
What are the most important factors for long-term squat development? Intensity, load, volume, question mark. Volume. That's it. But on a very serious note, the least important thing is intensity or load, which is essentially the same thing when it comes to squatting. When we look at load and when we look at intensity, what I would say, and the major importance of load and intensity, is twofold. The first thing is people constantly going too heavy, never actually accruing any volume, never actually doing any training, just constantly maxing out. That is the number one thing to kill any chance of progressing in squatting, is just going too heavy too often. The second aspect is the opposite of that, where somebody is almost afraid of pushing those loads up a small bit. So maybe they are doing the effective training methods where they're doing 10s, 8s, 6s, 5s, 4s, 3s, 2s and 1s over the course of 2 or 3 months of training. But they don't push the weights enough. They don't push themselves hard enough. Now, I know for a fact, if you're watching this video, it's highly unlikely you're in the second group, and it's more likely you're in the first group, because most people who lift weights like to lift heavy weights. That's why we do it. We want to be pushing heavy weights around the place. We don't want to be kind of treading water and pushing ourselves. But there certainly is people in that latter group who don't push themselves enough, who might need a coach or someone there with them to force them to do it, or they might just need to force themselves to adhere to the program. But with all of that being said, the most important thing for long-term squat progression is training twice per week at appropriate amounts of volume and then pushing those weights up incrementally.
After going up in a weight class, how much training can you get out of it? So that's the question this user's asking. And the answer is not as much as you think. So when we look at non-endurance sports, the caloric consumption, if that's what we're asking from this angle, isn't as valuable as you think. So short-term calories are pretty important. So largely we're talking about carbohydrates here. Protein is definitely important over the long run. Probably not as much as you think you'd need. Probably more than you're currently consuming, if we're to be honest ourselves. But in regards to carbohydrate intake, acute carbohydrate intake before, during and after can sustain both muscle mass from its anti-catabolic effects, but also from the energy utilization we get from carbohydrates. So when we go up in calories, or when we're going up in weight class, we're obviously going to be increasing calories. And unless you're in a severe deficit before, after that initial few weeks where you feel great from increasing the calories, you feel a little bit better from extra amount of carbs, you're probably not going to see a huge change in training capacity. We're not going to go somewhere from, I was training 4 times a week, now I'm training 10 times a week and everything's going so much better. What's probably going to happen is those 4 sessions you're doing are probably just going to increase in quality, and the weight will go up because you'll be slowly accruing muscle mass. Your positions will be a little bit more stable, and that's the kind of the real benefit. So you don't really get a lot of extra training. You'll get extra results if your training has been smart up until this point, and you continue with smart training. You'll get extra numbers, whether that be weightlifting or powerlifting, whatever the strength sport you're doing is. Those numbers will go up, but you're not going to be necessarily able to do, or you more importantly don't necessarily need to do extra training to see the benefits of the weight class gain. You can keep training volumes the same as you cyclically would apply it, but just go up in weight class and you'll see the benefits. So that's kind of a recipe for disaster or injury here, where you're gaining weight, so you're like, fuck yeah, it's time to squat every day. It's like, that's definitely not the answer. I would keep training volume largely similar, but what I would do is get training volume when it's high volume to coincide with your new weight class gain to maximize some of that lean muscle mass. But realistically, when you're gaining weight, you're probably only be going an extra 250 calories a day. So if you're going any more than that, don't go full slob mode and fuck yourself up,
Tips for long distance running and heavy squats or deadlifts. So a couple of things here. The first thing is, up until a certain point, squatting heavy and deadlifting heavy will certainly help your ability in the long distance running. So whether that is increased integrity of that ankle joint coming from the squats, or whether that is better postural control later on in the long distance runs coming from the deadlifts and squats, these things will help with running efficiency and help with maintaining that form later on into the races. So imagine if you are doing a half marathon, after 14 or 15k, you start to see that breakdown in your form, that breakdown in your posture, obviously limiting the amount of oxygen you're able to get in, but also just making your stride a bit more labored. Also, you could see things like that ankle collapsing due to lack of overall strength. All of these things will be helped by the strength work to a certain degree. Now, in the very same level and on that exact same spectrum, our strength work can negatively impact the running work if that strength work is of too high a volume or too high an intensity. So imagine it is a Monday evening, I have squatted heavy on a Saturday, my quads are very, very heavy and tired, but I also have some fatigue or some delayed onset muscle soreness in my lower back. What I'll oftentimes find happening is my stride will become altered, maybe my overall cadence has changed, and now I'm working a hell of a lot harder to get through my 10k training run on a Monday night. Much of the thing we'll have to do as a long distance runner who also wants to lift heavy weights is just monitor those loads, play around with how the training week looks to make sure neither of these things negatively impact the other. What I will say on the reverse side of things, of the effectiveness of long distance running on our strength training, is it's not going to have a massive impact. Now, what it will have a massive impact on is, firstly, our overall calorie consumption. So if I am doing a large amount of mileage per week, my overall calorie consumption will be a lot higher, and unless I'm effectively refueling and carb backloading to make sure I'm ready for the next day's sessions or that same day's session, I'm going to have trouble, particularly in the higher work capacity strength training session. So whether it's doing some high volume work on squats or whether it's doing a massive amount of deadlift work at 80% of 1 rep max, I'm going to struggle to get through those sessions, and particularly my recovery in between sets is going to be more difficult. Now, what I will say on top of the actual caloric intake is the effect that long distance running might have on strength training can come in the form of repetitive strain injuries causing issues with the squat, with the deadlift, with the power clean, whatever it is. So as runners, you might start coming up against repetitive strain injuries in the ankles, the knees, the hips, the back, wherever it is, and they can certainly negatively affect my ability to progress my squat from week to week or progress my deadlift over the course of a training cycle. Now, it's very important when you're doing this style of hybrid training that you're not just treading water on both. If you're not seeing progress in one or both of those aspects, or even in just one particular area of those aspects, so maybe your squat's not progressing very well but your deadlift is going up a lot, or maybe your 10k time isn't improving but your track running times are going down. If you're not seeing progress in any of those, it's very likely you've messed up your programming somewhere. It's very likely you're stealing from Peter to give to Paul and Paul's still not taking it or improving any amount at all. So be wary of that. Track everything. Track more so than if you were just powerlifting or if you were just running. Be wary of the interplay there and that interference effect that's going to come from it. And just give yourself some latitude on it. If you usually make 10 kilos increase in your squat in 8 weeks, you're probably going to take at least twice as long if you're doing your long distance running with it.
If there's a lack of progression in supplemental exercises or assistance exercises, should you change them out in powerlifting? So I would say not necessarily. If there was a lack of progression in the main exercises, then I'd be looking at what your assistance exercise is, but I'd obviously be looking at everything else in regards to that. So without knowing your specific case, it's slightly harder to answer it, but my immediate answer wouldn't be no way, definitely change them out, or it's definitely time to change them. If your main lifts are going up and they're going up well enough, your assistance exercises are probably doing their job. So you might just be very poor at those assistance exercises, and doing them is providing sufficient stimulus that then your main lifts are going a certain direction. So it would really depend on the specific exercises you're looking at here. What way are you programming them? There's too many variables that I couldn't give you a great answer on this one, unfortunately, in regards to should you change them out. But the answer might be enough in the fact that I wouldn't immediately adjust them. I'd be looking at other variables first. assuming you picked appropriate assistance exercises. So look at the progression of your main lifts. If they're going well, then you don't necessarily need to be changing them. The assistance exercises, of course, have some bearing, some important bearing on the main lifts, but it's not the whole story. So there's a lot of things at play here that you'd need to look at.
Your favorite progression scheme for gaining muscle mass and strength for the average Joe. My favorite progression scheme here, let's just take your rugby player and you need to gain some size and strength in the off season. My favorite progression scheme here is virtually unchanged programming with double the amount of recovery and at least 25% extra calories. So if you're used to playing an in-season sport, you're on the pitch 3 or 4 times per week, all of those sessions being taken out and you just being in the gym, and then your normal calorie expenditure being 2,000, or your normal calorie intake being 2,000 calories per day, and that goes to 2,500 calories per day. That will make a monumental change to your ability to gain size and strength, whether it's in an off season or in a general hypertrophy phase. The second thing, but definitely in the back seat here, would be just going to slightly more voluminous training. So rather than a training session where you're doing 6 doubles on a bench press at 92%, you're instead doing 6 sets of 10 on the bench press at 70% of 1 rep max. That is really where we're kind of pushing the training. More volume, accruing more volume, doing a bit more damage to the muscle, really increasing the blood flow to that muscle. But by far, the biggest thing for gaining muscle mass and then gaining strength afterwards is increasing your ability to recover and increasing the caloric intake, so your body knows it has those proteins available to it and it has the energy not only to build the muscle in the first place, but to actually be able to afford to hold on to that muscle long term.
How long can you hold on to a peak, and why not longer? So you've inadvertently stumbled into the question that the academics and pra-academics have been arguing over for a while, and this is the argument between block periodization and concurrent periodization. So the argument here against block periodization is that you can't hold a peak for a very, very long time, usually somewhere in the period of a few days, maybe up to 2 weeks, depending on your sport. And then the argument then from concurrent periodization crusaders is that then you can't maintain that across the season, which are very valid arguments. And then it comes down to programming and sport-specific nature. The concurrent periodization people would say that what good is a peak to me if I have 6 months of a season? And that is a really good argument. The idea here, though, is that you don't necessarily need to be pushing one or the other. It may be that you could be dynamic with your programming. So the issue with peaking is that you needed a certain volume of training to sustain the stimulus to get you to a period where you could peak. So you can't just peak out of nowhere. You can't just walk up to 90% and be like, okay, I've done my peak week. Obviously, you need to sustain the training and produce adaptations by doing lots of volume in the lead up to that peak. What happens when you peak? Peaking is a reduction in intensity and a volume appropriately to allow you to super compensate, and where this adaptation curve overcomes where your max performance is now. And the idea then is that you hit your max performance, whether that be running or strength training or javelin throwing or whatever it is, you hit that perfectly when the competition arises. The issue is that it's not always super predictable. It can be within 3 or 4 days. That comes down to the programming and the athlete, of course. But the idea here is that volume is dropping off and it's giving you this opportunity to maintain or realize a peak and realize your performance. So the issue is that the adaptations slowly fade away. So there's this period where you're getting fresher. You've dropped the volume. You've upped the intensity. You've maintained the intensity, or maybe in some cases you've dropped the intensity, depending on what you're doing. You know, the week of a powerlifting competition, for example, where you're going to be dropping the intensity, massively dropping the volume, and it will have been dropping for preceding weeks. But then if we're looking at someone who's peaking for a jiu-jitsu competition, we're going to be dropping the intensity of rolling, or at least we should be, but then we might be increasing the intensity of our aerobic work because the short-term adaptations are important. So the issue is that the volume you do to gain this new progress eventually needs to be reapplied after a certain stage, or we'll see a certain percentage of that intensity or that peak drop off. So the issue with peaking is that we come into the peak, we drop the volume, we do what we need to do with the intensity depending on the sport, and then when you get to that peak, there's a certain tail after that peak where you could still hit those numbers, whatever your sport is, but eventually then you start to decay your fitness. Your fitness starts to fall off. Your fitness in this case is referencing to your sport, not your aerobic capacity or anaerobic capacity. So if you get too far away from the volume that it took you to get to this place where you could peak, eventually you'll start losing progress because you're not applying enough of that stimulus to keep you well trained. And then this is the issue with the peaks, is that after you peak, you need to detrain a little bit and then reapply the volume. And then this is the issue with concurrent people who like periodization, is that, look, I've done my power 2 months ago, but my power isn't going to sustain. So then it comes down to a lot of different questions. But the issue is you're essentially not doing enough training where you can maintain that peak, because eventually the stimulus has to be applied. We get this lag, or we get this window after we stop the volume where this progress maintains, but eventually your body goes, I don't need to be able to snatch 160 every day, do I? And then it drops off, which was, I suppose, the whole idea behind, if we're looking at weightlifting, the Bulgarian method. And I think the Norwegian athletics are doing something similar, not similar to the Bulgarians, by the way, thanks, Jesus Christ, similar in the idea to they're training close to their peak thresholds for reasonable amounts of time, rather than going with the traditional European method, which is 32 hours of running a week, or 42 hours of running a week, or 50 hours of cycling, or rowing days on end, or whatever. They're kind of going for a little bit more of a kind of close to threshold performance from what we've seen. They're measuring lactic threshold. It seems quite interesting. Is it practical, or is it they're just good runners and good programming, and is the rest of it kind of fluff? Who knows? There's a lot of hullabaloo about it in the running community, which is quite interesting to look at. But what does it come from is it's a larger question than we can give you in this one.
How to increase ankle mobility. Take out a post-it note and write this down. The first thing you do is you find a sports massage therapist as close to your house or your workplace as possible. You ring them and you go to them once per week for an hour. You make sure you get just sports massage on your calves and your Achilles tendons, maybe the bottoms of your feet as well. No acupuncture or anything like that. No heat pads, no muscle stim. Just very hard, deep tissue muscle massage once per week. Now, 4 times per week, I want you to find a 30-minute slot in your schedule. You're going to do a circuit of 3 exercises. So it's going to be a barbell rolling on your calf and your Achilles. You're going to do 1 or 2 minutes each side, and you're going to go hard on that. Go into the pain cave a little bit. Moderate discomfort will be pretty ideal. The second exercise you're going to do is a front foot raised split squat, pushing your knee as far over the toes as you possibly can, and holding that fully flexed ankle position for at least 90 seconds each side. The final thing you're going to do then is find a step where you can hang your heel out over the edge of the step. I want you to have a slight bend in your knee, pushing your knee forward over your toes, still pushing that ankle forward or down towards the ground, and you're going to hold that for 90 seconds. You will run through that circuit of rolling, stretching and stretching as many times as you possibly can during the 30-minute slot. If you start getting real pain or discomfort in the tendon, or soreness in the tendon that's lasting on maybe for longer than half an hour after those sessions, then you need to go a bit lighter next time. But you're going to do that at least 4 times per week, and your ankles will definitely be more mobile afterwards. Now, the final piece I'm going to say on this is during the front foot raised split squat, where you're pushing your knee forward over your toe. If you're finding a binding up sensation in the front of your ankle, as if the bone is stacking on top of it and it's stopping you moving any further, you're then going to get a strong resistance band. So the 3-inch thick or 4-inch thick resistance band from your gym, you're going to loop that around the front of your ankle and have it pulling with a quite large amount of tension to a squat leg upright or something behind you. You're going to use that as a banded distraction, and you will be able to push your knee far further forward over your toes.
Best type of squat for vertical jump and leg power. So there is a lot of people at the moment who make a lot of content about vertical jumping and leg power and being explosive. It's something that people really want to get better at, and they want it for your sport, which is very laudable. The best type of squat is the full depth high bar squat. It's something we've seen a huge amount. There's some very interesting research. There's some really interesting research in comparison to half squats versus full depth squats. There's one name you might recognize if you look at a lot of the knee related research. It's Hartman, and he has done investigation. There's 2 good studies. There's one in 2012 and one in 2007, which looked at full depth squats versus half squats. Hartman was also the guy who looked at the shear forces in the knee, a pretty adept researcher if you look at his research. I've never met him, but he seems like a guy who likes his squatting and his knee angles and all that good jazz. But he looked at that in relation to vertical jumping, and the full depth squat came out twice as something that is far better for vertical jumping. We see it ad nauseum. We talked about how many parkour athletes run our programs and they improve their broad jump and their standing jump and their vertical jump from those full depth squats. They're always very mobile, which is very, very interesting, and they put up some big numbers. The closer you get to a triple body weight high bar squat, the better your jumping is. After that, it's probably going to be diminishing returns. But if you can get to close to that triple body weight high bar squat, you're going to really maximize your capacity for jumping. We'd like to see at least a minimum of double body weight back squat when we're looking at strength exercises that transfer to jumping. I don't buy joint angle specific stuff. I'm not buying it as years go on. I don't particularly think it's very, very useful. If we look at those particular studies in regards to jumping, a lot of people would say that, the specific angles we train in the gym but are going to be the ones we should be using, but we don't approach S&C like that in any other fashion. So I don't really buy into why we would be super specific with our angles in regards to something like jumping. We know full range of motion is a little bit harder, but we also get more muscle mass. We get longer stretching of the tendons. Our ability to overcome these points are on the way down and on the way up, rather than passing through them through more disadvantaged positions. We'll also see some interesting investigations on isometrics. So sometimes we see people like to use isometrics for jumping, but you'll actually see very little or no positive impact on counter movement jumping. So a max counter movement jump or a vertical jump, you'll see that isometrics are largely useless, especially if you're doing a lot of isometrics. You'll see isometrics will be useful from an isometric position. So if you do lots of isometrics and you do in a pause jump, you'll see that they will probably improve, but your dynamic effort when it comes to a counter movement jump where you're standing and you're squatting down aggressively, you're amortizing really aggressively, you're using your stretch shortening cycle really aggressively, you're just not going to improve from isometrics. You might improve in spite of, you might just be a talented jumper, but in most cases that these isometrics aren't great, those shorter angle squats aren't great. I think full depth squats, we've seen them, there's some research to back it up. Muscle physiology, if we look at it in certain ways, would back that up as well, are the best to go when it comes to jumping. Now you also said leg power. Squatting again is going to be a big one, but you may need to introduce some single leg work here. Power is a very specific word, so when we're looking at going from vertical jumping and squatting, we're seeing a fairly reasonable 1-to-1 ratio or a fairly direct path there. But when it comes to leg power could mean a lot of things. Does it mean you want more power in your legs for a scrum, or does it mean you want more power in your legs for sprinting? So in some ways the outcome there, the additional work we do might be different. So you could be looking at extra single leg work. We were talking to Dane Miller from Garage Strength if you're American, and he really likes heavy single leg split squats, which is one of the more interesting things I've seen in the last few years. Obviously on top of, he produces some very big squatters anyway, but when it comes to leg power, you probably need a bit more specificity or a little bit different, so it depends on what leg power you were looking at.
How would you program S&C for special forces? So special forces or tier 1 guys are probably the most interesting group that I coach 1-to-1. We've had multiple people go through selection and multiple people currently in service, whether you're on the US side or the UK side. To be honest, both of these are very interesting for a couple of reasons, right? First thing is there's a massive difference between selection in the UK and selection in the US and what they're looking for in terms of how we train them or what the programming looks like. The second thing is that you probably don't ever have a group of athletes who need to be more resilient to injury than in this particular group. So whether it's jumping out of helicopters or planes, landing hard on the ground, whether it's concussive impacts, whether it's shoulders, whether it's particularly mid-back and lower back from carrying loads, and then obviously their lower bodies tend to be quite destroyed from carrying loads over long distances. It's an incredibly interesting puzzle to solve. Now, how do you go about training it? This is the ultimate application of a needs analysis. If it's somebody going for selection, particularly selection in the UK, long distance endurance is massively important. For selection anywhere, just getting them to selection in a relatively healthy and good shape is a major challenge. A lot of the time you're dealing with previous injuries, a lot of the time you're dealing with people who are currently serving and so aren't necessarily in the best position to be rehabbing everything to the best possible extent. And then also you need to look at their relative size and shape and figure out, okay, they might be 6 foot tall, 110 kilos, absolutely yacked, which is great for carrying things, great for a very strong packing ability. But now once we start stretching that out to 10 miles, it becomes a lot more difficult. Now you also get to the point where you have lean whippets who are very, very good at covering that distance. Put a bit of load on them and they're not quite so good. Particularly put a bit of load on them when they're having those incredibly impactful landings on the ground, like a parachute or something like that, and then we start seeing a lot of those knee injuries. So for the S&C guys, it's really looking at where they are right now and making them as robust as physically possible. Most of the time, there's a lot of endurance and a lot of running work in there. Some of the time, that endurance work has to come on an erg of some type, because there's a lot of meniscuses missing in that particular world, and so it goes to a rowing machine, an air bike, a static bike, and just getting the mileage into them, then making those major physiological changes on an erg, and then getting them to do the specific ruck training in the course of those few weeks you have them for. And the S&C work is really just making sure they're in a good, or as good a position as possible, as healthy a position as possible, to be able to do the test for selection. Then once people are in the services themselves, we start seeing people liking to specialise a small bit more. So a lot of them like to be a bit stronger and a bit bigger, which is absolutely A-okay in my books. And it really is just coming down to where they're at right now and what their specific thing is once they've already been selected and once they already have their own kind of goals made out in their own heads.
Thanks for watching today's Q&A episode. Please leave your comments in the one below. Just a note on the Special Forces. I've noted that none of them have invited us to come shoot their guns with them, so that is really something noteworthy and will be held against them. And hope you enjoy your weekend, and we'll see you next week.